Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're basically stepping straight into the boardroom for a high-stakes, purely cinematic corporate strategy session. Listen, if you've ever felt like navigating office dynamics is like playing this incredibly complex game of chess, well, you are definitely not alone, and you're in exactly the right place. We're going to be breaking down Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. Now, I know you might be thinking, this source material is deeply rooted in ancient history and centuries-old tactical maneuvers. But the truth is, its cunning essence translates perfectly into an actionable, modern executive playbook. We're going to examine these laws specifically from the perspective of a modern executive trying to, well, survive and ultimately thrive in today's fiercely competitive corporate environments. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda for today's session. We'll start with number 1, the modern corporate court. Then 2, guarding your executive image. 3, mastering office dynamics. 4, strategic influence and execution. And finally, number 5, knowing when to stop.
Starting off with Section 1, the modern corporate court. So, the preface of our source material talks about this concept of the ancient courtier. Back in the day, this was a person who literally clustered around a king or an emperor. But here's the catch. Violent or super overt power moves were heavily frowned upon. To be a successful courtier, you had to be a master of the indirect move. They achieved their goals through immense charm, incredibly subtle strategy, and yes, sometimes outright deception, all while appearing perfectly elegant and polite. Think about the most successful VP or director in your company right now. Chances are, they are a modern master of this exact art.
It's actually a crazy paradox we face today. Think about the aristocratic court. It was basically a civilized war of indirect stabs in the back. Now contrast that with the modern boardroom. Today, absolutely everything must appear decent, democratic, and totally fair. But let's be real, if you play by those rules too literally, you're going to get crushed. The text actually points to Napoleon's advice here. You must place an iron hand inside a velvet glove. You have to appear perfectly civilized while maneuvering very prudently behind the scenes.
Moving right along to Section 2, guarding your executive image.
The source outlines a few crucial laws that basically form the foundation of your executive image. Law 4 tells us to always say less than necessary. Law 5 warns that everything depends on your reputation, so you literally have to guard it with your life. And Law 25 advises you to constantly recreate yourself. The big takeaway here is that the corporate machine is naturally going to try and foist a specific role onto you. But as a leader, you've got to forge your own identity if you ever want to command attention in a crowded inbox or a super noisy boardroom.
I love this example. The artist Andy Warhol utilized Law 4 brilliantly. He realized that by just giving these really short answers and totally embracing silence, he immediately put interviewers on the defensive. They would get nervous and just fill the silence with valuable information, while his vague, kind of open-ended speech made him appear profound and firmly in control. Take a second to really let that land. Think about your next high-stakes negotiation or even your performance review. Silence is absolute leverage.
On the flip side, the source shares this wildly gripping historical anecdote about the sheer danger of words. Okay, so in 1825, there's this Russian rebel named Kondraty Ryliev, and he's sentenced to hang. The trapdoor opens, and the rope snaps. Now back then, surviving a hanging was often seen as a sign of divine providence, which usually meant an automatic pardon. But instead of keeping his mouth shut, Ryliev stands up, brushes himself off, and arrogantly yells to the crowd, "You see, in Russia they don't know how to do anything properly, not even how to make rope." Well, when Tsar Nicholas I heard about this little quip, he tore up the pardon and ordered him hanged again. And guess what? The next day the rope did not break. The lesson here? Once your words are out, you can never take them back. That sarcastic Slack message or that hasty reply all, that can instantly destroy a second chance you didn't even know you had.
All right, Section 3. Mastering office dynamics. Now, what's really interesting about this concept, this idea of the third eye of the spy, is from Law 14. It suggests that gathering foreknowledge about your colleagues is absolutely essential. You've got to know their true motives before you make a move. And the best way to pose as a friendly, helpful colleague while you're carefully, quietly observing everything.
The text details this fascinating strategy from King Chosroes. He didn't just sit around and wait for a crisis to test his courtiers. No, he would pull someone aside and share a totally fake but highly sensitive secret. Then, he'd just sit back and watch the rest of the court. If the person who supposedly didn't know the secret started acting all tense and aloof around the king, well, Chosroes knew exactly who leaked it. It's an incredible method of tempting people into certain acts to reveal their true honesty and loyalty long before a real problem ever pops up. Translated to today, that's like floating a highly sanitized rumor about a project shift to just one colleague, solely to see if it eventually makes its way back to you.
And look, while you're busy figuring everyone else out, you absolutely cannot let them figure you out. Law 17 is all about cultivating an air of unpredictability. Humans absolutely crave predictable patterns. It gives us this comfortable sense of control. The text cites Duke Filippo Maria of Milan. This guy would suddenly shower his courtiers with tons of attention, only to follow it up the very next day with utter disdain. By intentionally breaking your own patterns, you keep your rivals totally off balance and in the state of suspended terror, basically wearing themselves out just trying to explain your moves. Now, in a modern office, obviously this doesn't mean being abusive or erratic. It just means being strategically unreadable. Like maybe you ask an unexpected, highly technical question during a totally routine status update, just to make sure your team stays on their toes.
Next up, Section 4, Strategic Influence and Execution.
When you think about execution, you kind of have to imagine the gods on Mount Olympus looking down on human actions. It represents Law 29, plan all the way to the end. The source points out that historically massive leaders, like the Prussian statesman Bismarck, succeeded because they didn't just plan for the initial victory. They actually anticipated every potential crisis, every single reaction, and they planned straight through to the very conclusion. They refused to be derailed by the sudden temptation to just improvise. For a modern executive, this literally means looking way past the initial launch of a quarterly rollout or an M&A integration and actually planning for the inevitable friction you're going to face 6 months down the line.
Part of planning to the very end is recognizing the traps along the way. Law 40 states, despise the free lunch. I want you to seriously consider this in your own organization for a second. What is the true cost of that free favor a colleague is suddenly offering you? The text argues that what is offered for free usually involves a trick, a hidden obligation, or a massive guilt trip later on. By always paying your own way, you steer clear of deceit and maintain your absolute strategic independence.
Which brings us nicely to the keyhole concept from Law 43. Look, when you need to execute a big strategy, sheer force only creates pushback. You must work on the hearts and minds of others. The text asserts that self-interest is the strongest human motive, hands down. You have to essentially peer through the keyhole of your colleagues' individual psychologies and find the specific key that unlocks their door. You can't just tell them the plan. You have to show them exactly how your plan benefits them.
And that brings us to our final phase, Section 5, Knowing When to Stop. Law 47 says, in victory, learn when to stop. The source explains a really interesting psychological trap. Success actually goes to your head. It creates this literal intoxication of victory. When you finally land that massive client, or you win that incredibly draining boardroom battle, the pure adrenaline totally tempts you to push even further. But doing so almost always leads to aggressive, uncalculated overreaches that can be completely fatal to your career.
Here is a pretty harsh historical truth from the text to illustrate this: the actions of Philip of Macedon. He would routinely disgrace and outright demote his own top generals immediately after they won a huge, amazing victory. Why would he do that? Because if they kept winning, they might get too popular and become a direct rival to his throne. In a modern context, this highlights the immense, often unseen danger of outshining the master. You might severely over-deliver on a project because you just want to prove your incredible dedication, only to accidentally trigger the deep-seated, quiet insecurities of your boss.
Which really leaves us with this final, lingering thought to chew on today. The text makes it absolutely clear that ultimate power isn't just about controlling everyone else, it truly lies in supreme self-control. So when that intoxicating rush of success hits you, will you have the godlike restraint to know exactly when to stop once you've conquered your boardroom? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep a close eye on the dynamics going on around you. Catch you next time.